The palace is silent, but not still. Behind velvet curtains, a woman screams, not of pain, but something stranger, like grief arriving too soon. The candles flicker as if trying not to see. Blood pools across sheets soaked in royal silk. And in her trembling arms, the queen holds a child, limp, twisted, and silent. This is not the cry of a miracle. This is not the triumph of a throne secured. A nurse gasps, then averts her eyes. The physician stammers. And the midwife, with calloused hands once trusted by monarchs, mutters a word no courtier dares speak aloud. Monster. He would grow to be king of Spain, yet never speak. Never walk unaided. His jaw too deformed to chew, his body collapsing. Inward from generations of inbreeding, dynastic obsession, and denial. He was the final heir of a doomed empire and the walking proof of its moral decay. But history remembers him as a grotesque footnote. A joke. A cursed king today, we strip away the legend. Behind the horror lies a mother, Queen Mariana of Austria, forced to watch her son rot alive, while priests whispered of demons and courtiers plotted over his cradle. This is not a tale of monstrosity. It is a tragedy of empire, a family's self-destruction carved into the bones of a child, and a woman trapped between maternal love and imperial duty. This is the story of Charles II of Spain and the queen who gave birth to him. The palace never slept. Its walls, thick with centuries of breath and dust, exhaled with the low murmur of servants and the rustle of gowns soaked in incense. In the velvet silence of Madrid's royal corridors, Queen Mariana walked slowly, as if gravity pulled heavier on her than others, not because she carried a child, but because she carried a dynasty. She was 16 when the crown claimed her, not as a bride, as an obligation. Her uncle, and now husband, King Philip IV, older than her father, placed a ring on her finger with the same numb exactitude as one signs a treaty. She said nothing. Neither did he. In the Habsburg courts, silence was obedience, and obedience was survival. The marriage was a knot tied not in love but in blood, a twisted loop centuries in the making. Habsburg to Habsburg, aunt to nephew, uncle to niece. Mariana had been raised with portraits of ancestors who looked like mirrors. Eyes too close, jaws too wide. She knew what the blood did, but knowing did not matter. The first child died within hours. The second was born without a skull. The third arrived in winter and never learned to cry. The court said prayers. The priests blamed sin. But the whispers began to slide behind fans and down the marble halls. It is the queen. It is the blood. It is her womb. Mariana felt it, not just in her body, but in the way eyes lingered too long or not at all, the way the midwives tightened their mouths, the way the king avoided her bed except when duty called. Her body became a public monument of failure, a vessel judged by what it could not hold. Each pregnancy felt less like creation and more like penance. She felt life begin inside her as a flicker, and a weight, then a threat. Her back broke beneath the weight of 1,000 years of incestuous order. No one asked if she was afraid. She wouldn't have answered. They laced her into gowns that pressed her ribs to bruises. They braided her hair into crowns of gold and glass. They painted her cheeks pale so she looked less alive. But underneath the silks, her skin itched from holy oils and bruises shaped like hands. She vomited blood more often than food. Still, she curtsied. There were nights she woke to the taste of iron and the scent of burning candles. Alone, except for the sound of bells. Somewhere, someone always prayed, not for her, for the heir she might yet produce, for the survival of a name too old to be questioned. She once pressed her palm against the nursery wall, the one that had remained empty for years. Cold, the stone drank her heat without memory. No laughter ever echoed there. Only ritual. Only waiting. Every month her body bled or broke, and yet the throne did not weep for her. It demanded again, and again, and again. When she did birth a child who breathed, the court rejoiced, not for her, but for the line, for the illusion that the blood still ruled. But that child, too, soon sickened. Their limbs trembled. Their skin turned waxen. They died before names could be carved, and still she returned to the marital bed. Still she endured, not as a woman, as a relic of imperial function, as a wound wrapped in lace and crowned with pearls. No one ever asked how it felt to carry the weight of an empire in the hollow between her hips. How it felt to know that every failure bled not just into her sheets, but into the lineage of Christendom itself. How it felt to watch priests counter miscarriages like sins. Mariana never screamed, not aloud. But something inside her stopped breathing long before her son was born. And when she was told, at last, that this next child had survived the night, that he had lived, she felt nothing, because she had learned that life was not always a blessing, especially not here, not when the empire had already claimed his bones, not when the silence that followed felt more final than any death, not when her womb had become a tomb that the world mistook for a cradle. The candles had already burned low by the time the screaming stopped. Thick air, soaked with blood and frankincense, clung to the drapes and choked the walls. The room stank of iron and sweat, not of triumph, but of something ancient and wrong, no. One moved, the queen lay half-conscious, her face gray beneath the crust of ceremonial powders, her mouth parted in silence, not sleep. Her hands trembled under the embroidered sheet, fingers twitching as if trying to remember how to hold something that should feel like joy. But no one brought her the child, because the child did not cry. The midwives whispered. A priest muttered, Latin under his breath, as if spells could undo what had been done. A nurse crossed herself 3 times, then turned her back to the cradle. The doctor held the newborn, as though it might bite. His lips were dry. His fingers twitched near the swaddled bundle, but he would not meet its eyes. The boy's skull was soft and misshapen, as if God had run out of clay. His tongue, grotesquely large, spilled from his lips like meat on a butcher's block. His skin was pale as candle wax, veins visible, eyelids fluttering but unfocused. And his breath, shallow, erratic, rasped like old paper torn in the yaw. Wind, they said nothing for 3 full minutes. Then the king entered, slow and heavy, smelling of musk and wine and something colder. His boots echoed too loudly on the marble floor, breaking the silence like a sin. He looked at the child, just once, then looked away. The silence was broken only by the rustle of fabric as the physician stepped forward. Your Majesty, he said carefully, the infant is alive, not healthy, not strong, not royal, just alive. As if that alone were worthy of praise. Or penance, the king nodded. A single slow gesture, like a man accepting a verdict he'd known was coming. He said nothing to the queen, nothing to the child. He turned and left without looking back. Behind him, the doctors began to argue. One said it was demonic interference, that the queen had offended the saints. Another whispered of the queen's blood, too tangled with its own lineage, too thick with rot. Another muttered about omens, about comets, about heretics. No one said the word inbreeding, but everyone thought it still the child breathed. And the empire needed a future, even a broken one, so they washed him, swaddled him in silk, painted holy oils over a skull that would never harden, gave him a name, Carlos Charles King, someday a miracle, they called him, and already the lie had begun. In the weeks that followed, artists were summoned. They were instructed not to paint what they saw. They softened the jaw, narrowed the eyes, erased the slack tongue that could not retract. In portraits, he became cherubic, holy, blessed. In truth, his body was beginning to twist inward. His neck could barely hold his head. He did not suckle, but Spain needed a prince, and so the myth grew. Priests held mass. Courtiers toasted with trembling hands. Pamphlets were printed proclaiming divine favor. They spoke of Mariana's purity, of Philip's wisdom, of the sacredness of continuity. No one spoke of what the servants whispered in the halls, that the child's eyes wandered without meaning, that he screamed at shadows, that his limbs bent the wrong way. A queen rarely saw him. When she did, her hands would hover inches above his skin, uncertain whether to cradle or recoil. She watched his mouth foam, his breath sputter, his body convulse like a puppet with snapped strings. And still, she whispered prayers, not to save him, but to survive him, because what they had brought into the world was not a prince. It was a prophecy, a living omen, and it would not die, not quickly, not quietly. It would linger, it would rule, and every hour it remained alive. The crown sank deeper into ruin. Mariana, still pale and hollow from the birth, stared into mirrors and saw her reflection warp. She began to walk the palace halls at night, barefoot, her steps unheard, her presence unacknowledged. They called it piety, but it was mourning for the son who breathed, for the empire that pretended, for the truth that no one would say aloud. He had been born alive, but not whole, and something inside Spain had already begun to rot. The palace had grown quieter with each passing year, not in peace, but in tension, the kind of silence that settles over something fragile, something that should have broken long ago, but didn't. A silence full of glances, held breaths, unfinished prayers, and in its heart sat a child who would never speak. By now, he was too old to be cradled, too limp to stand. His head lolled when lifted, his gaze fluttered like moth wings behind half-shut lids. Some days he shrieked without cause. Other days, he simply stared at light until his throat rasped dry. His tongue still crowded his mouth like a slab of meat. His limbs twitched, not with purpose, but with the spasm of a marionette whose strings had been yanked too often. The court called him sovereign. They stitched the title around him like a funeral shroud. Each morning, servants dressed him with careful hands, slipping his limp arms through brocade sleeves, buttoning stiff collars around a neck too weak to hold weight. His crown was sometimes propped behind him on cushions, sometimes held by another, never worn, and yet they painted him. Always they painted him. In oils, he was composed, eyes forward, shoulders square, lips shut. In brushstrokes, he became figure of majesty, touched by divine will. But the real child dribbled saliva down his chin. He giggled at nothing. He wept without sound. He didn't know the meaning of words, only tones. So they changed the tones. Nurses hummed in the key of command. Priests blessed him louder. Pages rehearsed every footstep, every gesture, every turn of the head before court appearances. Even his silences were scripted, every look choreographed, every falter rehearsed. He had become a breathing icon. Carried, not crowned, behind him stood his mother. Pale, exhausted, ageless. Queen Mariana spoke through regents, ruled through parchment, but lived behind curtains. Her son's condition was never named, only worked around. To name, it would invite collapse. To speak truth would dissolve the myth. She had learned to smile, even when the boy moaned during mass or defecated during ceremony. She wiped his mouth with gloves so fine they tore against his teeth. She whispered into his ear words he could not understand, just to hear something human in the room. At night, when he slept in fits and tremors, she sat beside his bed and watched him twitch like a dying animal. She remembered the nursery before it became a throne room. remembered when she had prayed he would live, and now, sometimes, without daring to finish the thought. She wondered if death would have been kinder, but the empire needed a king. So the performance continued. When foreign dignitaries arrived, Charles was rolled forward like a relic. He blinked. He smiled, though it was crooked and vacant. If he drooled, a servant dabbed. If he laughed, they said it was joy. If he shrieked, they said it was wisdom in disguise. And all the while, Mariana watched her son disappear inside a roll too large for any man, let alone a child half alive. No one spoke of the cruelty, of what it meant to place a crown upon a boy who could not feed himself, of what it meant for a mother to dress up her dying son as a god. Instead, they rehearsed parades, repainted portraits, reworded titles. The boy never asked to be king. He never asked for anything at all, and yet his silence ruled more absolutely than any monarch who came before. A silence made sacred, a throne polished not by wisdom, but by denial. And still he breathed, still he sat, still he reigned, though no one dared ask for how long. The palace windows no longer opened, not fully. The shutters groaned behind tapestries, stitched with saints and lions, but the air that passed through was stale, thick with ash, perfume, and the rot of too many secrets. Inside, something had turned, quietly, then quickly. Whispers moved faster than feet. Courtiers bowed lower, but with sharper eyes. Pages repeated orders not to obey them, but to record them. Every hallway had ears now. Every servant had a master beyond the one they served. And Mariana, the queen, the mother, the regent, began to walk as if someone were always watching, because they were. The boy king still breathed, still drooled in gold-threaded silence. But now, his body was not only a burden, it was a prize, a puppet throne from which power could be pulled like thread. He sat on velvet, and behind him, factions sharpened knives with their tongues. Some said the queen had bewitched him. Others claimed she was bewitched herself, a vessel for spirits that had cursed the royal line. The clergy, fat with incense and wine, demanded access to her chambers. They spoke of demons, of possession, of hidden sin. One monk claimed the devil had taken root in the boy's swollen tongue and must be exorcised by fire. They nearly did. It only the queen's threat of exile stopped the ritual, but not the suspicion. Even those who had once stood beside her now met her with fixed smiles and lowered voices. Her letters went missing. Her confessions were leaked. One morning, she woke to find her personal physician replaced, her confessor reassigned, and her mirror removed from the antechamber. She never asked why. She already knew. They were unmaking her, not with violence, not yet, but with a cold, systematic theft of self. Her runes were still hers, but emptier. Her words still spoken, but unheard. Her throne still warm, but hollowed out beneath her, and still the child remained. His body, that limp, groaning wreck of royal duty, became a battlefield. One faction propped him like a banner, declaring him sacred and untouchable. Another saw him as proof of divine punishment. Others, foreign and native, whispered that the line must end, quietly, mercifully. Mariana heard all of it. She saw their eyes linger on his throat when he choked, their hands twitch when he flailed during Mass. She saw how they looked at her, not with sympathy, but calculation. If the boy died, who would rise? And beneath it all, the court continued its rituals. Dinners were served, masses held, documents signed. The machinery of monarchy churned on, powered not by truth, but inertia. Even madness had its place here, as long as it wore silk. The queen stopped sleeping. She no longer undressed at night, fearing poison in her clothes. Her food was tasted 3 times. She whispered her prayers now, afraid they would be used against her. She had once ruled with parchment and persuasion. Now, she ruled by surviving. Each morning, she kissed the forehead of a son who could not speak her name. Each evening, she watched men kneel before him as if they believed. She wanted to scream, but knew they were waiting for that. They wanted her broken, they wanted her mad, they wanted her gone. And still she sat, still she reigned, because in this court, even grief had to obey, even love had to lie, and the mother of a dying king could never afford to weep, not where the vultures could see. By now, his shadow should have grown longer than hers, but he still walked like a toddler when he walked at all. Most days, Charles II was carried. His body had grown, but unevenly. Long limbs that bent inward, a torso too soft, a jaw too loose. His tongue still spilled from his mouth, thick and wet and senseless. He could form words, but they collapsed in his throat before they reached air. Sounds, yes. Grunts, murmurs, sometimes bursts of laughter that ended in coughing fits. But language remained a locked door. He could not hold a quill, could not ride a horse, could not feed himself without trembling, but he was king. His court watched him with reverence so performative it bordered on cruelty. Each public appearance was a masquerade of dignity, behind which priests whispered louder than ever. Some claimed he was a divine mystery, a holy fool, a chosen vessel sent to test the faithful. Others muttered darker things, that he was a punishment, that the devil had taken his cradle as an altar. One friar said the boy had no soul, that what lived behind those pale eyes was not human, but a hollow echo. Charles did not hear them. He stared through people, not at them. His mind flickered, not vacant, but unreachable. He seemed to sense pain before it arrived. He recoiled from sunlight. He cried at bells. Sometimes, without warning, his body would seize. His limbs would twist, his mouth would froth, and this room would hold its breath until the tremor passed. The physicians called it divine imbalance. Mariana called it Tuesday. She still kissed him every morning, though he never returned the gesture. She still whispered prayers at his bedside, even when his eyes rolled back in his skull. She still pressed her hands against his chest at night to feel the flutter of his heart and reassure herself that the empire had not yet collapsed. But she knew she had long since stopped asking for miracles. Now she asked only that he survive until morning, that he not choke again, that the rumors not sharpen into revolt. She had seen the way the ministers looked at him now, not with awe, but with calculation. She knew how often they met without her, how often they spoke of nephews, cousins, foreign marriages, fresh blood. But this was her son. This broken, blubbering shadow of a king was all that remained of Habsburg legacy, and she would not let them snuff it out. Even as the empire rotted, Spain's colonies begged gold, but its people starved, its armies limped, its ministers bribed and bickered. And still, Charles sat on the throne, silent and twitching and unknowing, a monarch in title, a child in spirit, a prisoner in flesh. He never chose this. No one asked if he wanted to rule, if he understood what ruling meant, if he understood anything at all. He had never known a day without pain, never lived without hands guiding him, wiping him, dressing him, feeding him. He had never loved, never reigned. He had only endured, and what the world called duty, he bore like a disease. The priests still debated his soul. The nobles still debated his worth. But the boy just stared at firelight, mouthing a song no one else could hear, lost. In a kingdom that lived only in his mind, he would be the last, and everyone knew it. Even Mariana, especially her. But still, each morning, she dressed him in silk, and each night, she buried hope beneath her pillow, like a blade she could not yet bring herself to use. The body gave out slowly, not with a scream, but a long, unraveling sigh. Charles no longer walked, no longer stood. His bones ached beneath the weight of robes he could not remove. His skin turned gray in places. His breath wheezed weightily at night. His fingers curled inward, stiff and bird-like, as if trying to hold something that had long slipped through. They told him he must marry. He nodded, or tried to, his tongue thick with mucus, his lips cracked. He did not ask who. He did not ask why. No one expected him to. He was the king, and kings did not question what the state demanded of their flesh. The first bride arrived with trembling hands and holy oils hidden in her sleeves. She was young, Austrian, pale. She wept at night and smiled during the day, her body rigid with prayer. She said she was ready to give him sons. No one told her he could barely lift a spoon. On their wedding night, attendants waited behind a velvet curtain. The candlelight flickered. Time passed. No cries, no laughter, only the sound of shivering. Then silence. They tried again. The second bride came with more silk, more jewels, more holy expectation. French this time. More practiced in flattery, less believing in miracles. She touched his hand once. He drooled on her wrist. She did not touch him again. No air came. Only fever. He began speaking of ghosts, of shadows in corners, of voices under the floor. He whispered to no one. He asked for his dead brother. He called for Mariana, even when she stood beside him. And when she answered, he flinched. As if death had finally spoken back, the priest said he was being tested, that God had chosen him for suffering, like Job, but Job had once had strength. Charles had nothing left to strip. Spain broke around him like porcelain. Its borders cracked, its debts deepened, its gold vanished into foreign pockets. War crept at the edges. The court played games of succession, their eyes fixed not on the throne, but on the grave beneath it. Mariana no longer fought. Her hands were gnarled with prayer, her face a map of sleepless decades. She sat beside him as he coughed blood onto lace, as his bowels loosened without warning, as he forgot the names of saints, of uncles, of God. She did not cry. There were no tears left, only the slow folding of legacy into nothing, only the sound of bells tolling when no one had died yet. The courtiers began speaking of after, of peace, of marriage alliances, of other bloodlines. They did not lower their voices. They did not wait for the king to sleep, because Charles was not dying. He was already dead in all but name, and still the rituals continued. They combed his thinning hair, dressed him in ermine, pushed rings onto fingers that could no longer feel. They raised his hand in greeting while he stared into space. They held audiences where he could not speak. And behind it all, the empire whispered like an exhausted ghost. He was the last, the end written in blood, spit, and royal ink. No child would come. No line would continue. The centuries of divine right and holy birth had delivered only this: a body that stank of rot before the grave, a crown heavier than bone, a mouth too ruined to kiss or curse. And when he coughed again, Mariana flinched, because she knew one day soon the sound would stop and nothing would rise in its place. The tomb was carved before he died, not in stone, but in memory, in portraits smeared with mockery, in court reports sealed with silence, in textbooks that would reduce him to a grotesque ending, a cautionary tale, a joke with a crown. Charles the bewitched, Charles the inbred, Charles the monster. But monsters do not weep. Monsters do not shiver at touch. Monsters do not call for their mothers in the hours before dawn, half choking on their own breath, and long after the bells tolled and the velvet curtains were drawn. There were letters, faded, frantic, folded. 1,000 times they bore her hand Mariana the queen, the regent, the mother, the woman who knelt beside a throne that never welcomed her son, who kissed a forehead burning with fever and felt her legacy slipping through sweat and salt, who was told again and again to pray harder, to trust more, to obey longer, and who did. The letters never say she hated him, even when his body spasmed for hours and left her robe stained, even when he bit her fingers in confusion, even when he moaned without meaning for days. She does not call him a curse. She calls him my son, my burden, my sorrow, my sacred one. She writes of his hands, how they trembled but reached for her still, of how his eyes, on rare days, followed the flicker of light as if chasing something he almost remembered, of how his laughter, though broken, made the air feel less dead. She writes of how they dressed him for burial before he died, how they folded the empire's final prayers into his sleeves, how they pressed coins into his fists, as if gold could pay for a lifetime UNLIVED. And when the time came, when his lungs failed in silence, when the palace grew still not from grief, but from relief, she did not scream. She sat beside his body, and she wept, not for the king he never became, but for the child no one ever saw, because beneath the layers of silk, beneath the rot of royal blood, beneath the weight of 10 generations crushed into one fragile spine, there had been a boy who never chose this, who never asked to be born to marble and mirrors and masks, who never asked to be held up as holy or cursed or useful, a boy who wanted only warmth, only stillness, only something soft to hold on to before sleep. But Spain did not give him that. The empire carved him into a symbol, and symbols cannot breathe. They erased his name and replaced it with a warning. Yet the tragedy was never that Charles failed to be a king. It was that no one allowed him to be anything else. No voice ever said, "Let the boy rest, let him run, let him fall, let him forget, let him love." Instead, they built him into a monument while he still breathed, and buried him before he stopped. Now, centuries later, his portraits still hang in palaces. His eyes still watch in silence. But those who look only see deformity, weakness, decay. They do not see the boy humming to himself in a corner, the boy frightened by fire, the boy reaching out again and again for a hand that never came. And maybe, just maybe, the monster was never in the mirror. It was behind the crown waiting